take part in the community poll linked in the description to let us know what kind of content you prefer from this channel. Figured I might as well tell you, I've got a whole slew of scripted Series 12 reviews on another channel. Watch those and compare with this video to see which, if any, of my views have changed since airing. Look, back when I initially completed the script for this video, I'd had a whole long preamble apologizing for taking so long to get this done, and that was 5 months ago before school shut down. Since then, I've had to make script changes, revisit the series multiple times, and honestly, if I come away with anything, it's that even my biggest complaints about the worst episodes from this year feel like such small peanuts to me. I'm gonna level what I find to be fair criticism at every story in Series 12, but the world just feels like such a worse, more hopeless place than it was back when these episodes aired, and I want this video to reflect the appreciation that I have for this show trying its best to be a source of hope and positivity. I've spent a good chunk of this year depressed and angry about things beyond my control, and Series 12 of Doctor Who, for the 3 or 4 times I've gone through it, has not been one of those things, and for that I'm grateful. Heck, the state of the world right now has thoroughly trounced any sense of the passage of time as I know it, so this video both feels way too late and hardly late at all. Either way, this is good. This is fine. It's good to have well over a full half a year's distance from Series 12, and when this video releases, it gives perspective. At least, that's what I have to tell myself. Anyway, I decided I liked the sort of pseudo-rating scale I used for last series, which given how long ago that video was, I guess I should re-explain before we jump into talking about the episodes. For a start, this video won't be split up into parts the way the Series 11 retrospective was. What I have to say about the show's presentation, style, music, etc. hasn't changed all that much from 2018, and I don't think I'd be justified in making a separate video about characters this time. This is strictly a video going over my current stance on the individual episodes and the series as a total package now that some time has passed. Strong minus means it's one I thoroughly did not enjoy and will almost certainly never seek out to watch again after the writing of this video. Light minus means it's lukewarm, more in it that I disliked than liked, but not unsalvageable or unwatchable. Light plus means the strengths outweigh the weaknesses, but it's not something I think is stellar and anything I can't see flaws in. This is probably the broadest of the ratings in my mind, the one with the biggest range of quality. These are the decent to solid ones, the ones that I might occasionally get the urge to rewatch just for fun, and the way I talk about one Light Plus episode might sound very different to how I talk about another. Strong Plus means it's cream of the crop. Hardly anything about it bugs me, and I'll likely use it as a go-to example of this show's strengths. Blank means it didn't leave too much of an impression either way. These ratings are not something that I would directly correlate to a numbered scale like a 1 through 5. For kicks and giggles, I will use the ratings of each individual story to create a very loose sort of enjoyment ratio for the season as a whole, wherein I tally how many episodes got which ranking, and use that to correlate a rough percentage of the overall season. Two-parters will be rated as one story, and the context of each rating is primarily relative to other episodes of the show, as opposed to any other media. Without further ado, let's get it on! I feel like these 2 episodes should have absolutely had 2 different titles, as only part 1 is really a spy riff. I suppose some spy tropes stick around for part 2, but it definitely feels like 2 distinct halves of one story, with a different setting and configuration for the characters across each one. To start on the negatives, it's bad that before my most recent rewatch, I'd completely forgotten about Daniel Barton and Vor as part of this story. Yeah, insert your trite Vor jokes here, whatever, get it out of your system. I don't even have a problem with Barton's ultimate plan and concept, or even how on-the-nose his online privacy speech is, but all of that being backloaded to the end of the story makes it feel out of step with the rest of the episode. Almost like the whole concept of Barton and his plan should have been the center of another story instead of just the tertiary plot of this one. Like, I spent his entire big villain speech saying to myself, wow, does this feel like it's not a natural addition to the Master and Kassavan plot? I get that surveillance tech and online information makes sense as a tie to a spy story, but in practice the connection is too broad. On a better note, the Kassavan themselves are a neat idea and a great visual, though still a bit underutilized for all the potential they have as a genuine source of menace. I doubt we'll ever see them again, and it sucks that they have to take a backseat, but if they were gonna be second fiddle to anyone, it might as well be my favorite master. Sacha Dhawan just imbues the Master with so much character, and I gotta say, of a great performance across two separate two-parters, my favorite bits of acting are when he's portraying O. You can tell he's full of barely restrained contempt with just a smidge of affection and respect, while also having a ball as he pretends to be scared by his own business partners. Once the jig is up though, his performance remains spectacular with all the anger and hatred on full passionate display. The way we use him to push the Doctor to places she never had to go in Series 11 is excellent, and I maintain that the cliffhanger of Part 1 is both a great bit of character writing and some top-notch drama. It's unfortunate that even Chibnall's more well-received stories are still emblematic of his problems writing or juggling the three companions, namely that he's really good at endearing moments in a vacuum, but so far really bad at any kind of complete character growth arc for them. I like watching this group together a lot, but it's not enough to find their dynamic likable if it's never going to evolve. Yaz's sheer terror at being taken to the Kasavan dimension is palpable, and Mandip Gill plays it phenomenally, and it just never amounts to anything in this story. The same principle unfortunately applies to the historical figures Ada Lovelace and Noor Khan. Great moments, no tangible meat to their story presence. Speaking of great character moments though, to swing back to the positive, the Doctor as usual carries this one, and I love how much this story relies on 13's characterization as more insecure and vulnerable than other Doctors, something which I think informs her arc across the whole season. The very opening scene of Part 2, where she has this very nervous conversation with herself, it's just a really great bit of character writing, spotlighting her fear of being alone and how thin her veneer of confidence around the others actually is. The Doctor talking out loud to themselves is already a common trope of the show, but it so rarely feels like a genuine nervous tic the way it does with 13. I also love Jodie's performance in the final sequence of the episode. The way she swings wildly between frantic and hesitant as she sets the TARDIS on course for Gallifrey, and then the pure grief and anger she has at finding what the Master's done, it's brilliant stuff. Spyfall was a great first foot forward for Series 12 for a lot of people, and by comparison, my thoughts on it don't exactly sound like a rave. But that said, a lot of the story problems hardly have time to bug me because the flow is so solid. None of the time that you could argue is wasted feels wasted. Its sheer fun factor and the standout moments it does have more than outweigh its weaknesses to create a light plus pair of episodes. If you check out the All Things Doctor Who channel linked in the description, you'll find that this episode is one that gets a surprising amount of airtime on there, with scripted reviews from both myself and my collaborator and friend Lucy, which I think you should check out. I'll admit I've softened a bit on Orphan 55 during a second watch. Not that I think it's any good at all, but in my initial reviews I came at it like it was one of the worst things I'd ever seen. On a rewatch, I just can't bring myself to get that worked up about it again. Now it's less one of the worst things I've ever seen and more just one of the worst modern Doctor Who episodes I've ever seen. I'll give the episode this: something is always happening. I prefer my stories with character interaction and room to breathe, but I also appreciate an episode with genuine forward momentum and a sense of action. Sadly, that's not enough to make the story actually exciting, and the biggest problem with it, aside from structure and editing that can get straight up incomprehensible at points, is just how bloody thematically empty it is. There are so many characters in this story, all of whom nominally have arcs, but none of which actually mean anything or coalesce into an episode with anything to say beyond the climate message. There's the seeds of a thematic throughline regarding parents and their children, which if handled smartly could have woven together with the climate message to make a story about generational responsibility. But with how it only applies to half the cast and feels arbitrary and random in execution, this motif of wayward parent-child relationships feels utterly pointless. Not only does that not enhance the story, but it actively harms it. This episode literally wants me to sympathize with someone who became a domestic terrorist over pithy mommy issues. The entire plot cul-de-sac with Benny is meant to feel tragic, but instead just reads as screen time wasted. And for all the goings-on in this episode, with it being one of the few in the Chibnall era where people actually die across its runtime, there's no real overwhelming sense of danger or tension. Honestly, the fact that Orphan 55 tries to have actual stakes and that reads more like a weakness than a strength is just an indicator of how much of a mess it is. Almost as if to say that despite aiming for action and lethality, it somehow managed to be totally boring and featureless despite itself. It's far and away the strongest minus of the series. Talk about high highs after low lows, because I love Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror is just such a well-written piece of science fiction, dude, and a great look at a historical figure that both aggrandizes and humanizes. Tesla is a charming, confident, virtuous genius, but also has a bit of a bullheadedness and ego about him, something you get the sense was bred out of necessity. I mean, you look at the scene where he claims to be unaffected by the rage-filled protests towards him, only to slam into his office and throw an off-screen tantrum, Miss Scarrett's reaction telling us that this is a common occurrence, and you just know that someone facing this malignancy with the skin any thinner would go insane. I love the way that Tesla initially reacts to the Skithra. The way he assumes that minds capable of great technology must also be moral. That alone tells you so much about him, his worldview, his drive to create, and why Edison is so detestable to him. The Skithra themselves aren't the most unique or complex alien baddies out there, but they're memorable enough that I didn't have to look them up or rewatch the episode to remember their name, which is rarer than you'd think. They're really effective as a thematic device, as it's in contrasting them with the Doctor that we get a macro version of the conflict between Tesla and Edison, and we bring out some proper righteous anger from 13, which is a facet of the character I think Jodie doesn't get enough credit for selling. I even like things that are drawn attention to by tiny, tiny lines, like the Doctor mentioning how messy their ship is, the lack of care they have for the technology they find beyond in-the-moment utility as compared to Tesla, and the Doctor's earnest fascination looking at tech just like art. On that same spectrum, Thomas Edison is someone who views technology in a very utilitarian capitalistic lens and is also a jackass, but a multifaceted and human jackass rather than a one-dimensional archetype. The way he proves to actually care about some of his workers and genuinely useful and clever in places, if still slower than Tesla and the Doctor, makes for an interesting figure when they could have just chosen to demonize him at every turn. The episode even acknowledges that his business sense is a valid, if cynical and condemnable, form of intelligence in its own right. Scarrett is a cute and charming source of much-needed support and grounding for Tesla, and a nice parallel to the companions. Speaking of whom, if there's a single problem with the episode, it's the same companion issue I mentioned with Spyfall. Great moments all around, but hardly any plot utility for any of them. Still, that's small peanuts in the grand scheme of how effortlessly charming, clever, and thematically solid this story is. It's the best character study of a historical figure this show has ever done behind Vincent and the Doctor, in my opinion. Tesla is a strong plus. Geez, I don't know how many friends I'm gonna make with this one. It occurs to me that the bulk of this episode is just the next Doctor, but done in complete earnest, and I appreciate that. Check out the podcast I did on that episode, by the way. Look, I'm not nearly as down on this episode as I was when I did my self-contained review of it back in the previous millennia that was pre-COVID. In fact, my assertion back then that there was no narrative to become invested in at all beyond the mystery box setup feels a little silly listening back. There is a story in Fugitive of the Judoon about upending the Doctor's worldview and self-perception, but the impact of it is lost among everything else. Fugitive is exactly the kind of fan service that tends to get a big pop from viewers of this show, and I won't lie and pretend I didn't feel the hype watching it. What I also felt, though, was a palpable sense that this story didn't take shape as best it could, and that letting this be Series 12's one contribution from the writer of Series 11's best story was a real waste. Chibnall wanted this episode to be the mid-series reminder and turning point for the arc of the season, and Vinay Patel's voice feels utterly lost and constrained, to the point where I'm not convinced that Chibnall couldn't have written this exact script all on his own. The Judoon themselves are really just here as a veil, as a means of throwing us all off with their presence, making first-time viewers assume that their return alone is what makes this episode special. I suppose there's worse ways to utilize what was always a fairly generic race conceptually. Captain Jack Harkness, though, for as much as I love him, just shouldn't be here. His only purpose for being here is to generate hype and lay down a mystery box for a few episodes down the line that doesn't really benefit from having been set up here at all. I maintain that the only other practical reason to bring him back without having him meet the Doctor at all is to tease future appearances in Series 13, which, I mean, if he doesn't show up there, then it would make less than zero sense to include him in a story where he plays no role even thematically. That, and I guess he gives the companions something to do, which, really makes me think. Not only would I rip Jack out of this episode if given the chance, I'd also make it a companion light adventure. The bookend scenes with Ryan, Graham, and Yaz in the TARDIS are really, really good stuff, and I can't help but wonder if they'd land even better if the Doctor had, say, chosen to exclude them on this outing, maybe just to avoid their questions. Have the Doctor be left alone, twisting in the wind as they're bombarded with all these world-changing developments, only to have her fam give her some much-needed hope and emotional support after a really dark and confusing chapter in her personal story. And I don't think me suggesting this is trying to armchair quarterback, or to rewrite the core of the story as I criticize it. I think this is what the episode is going for, and it would succeed way, way more than it does if we could just keep the focus. All the stuff between Jodie Whittaker and Joe Martin is genuinely compelling, and the purpose it all serves for the Doctor's character is really neat. Having to cut away from it for something totally and completely unrelated for minutes at a time just leaves us with half a truly great story, and half a story's worth of pointless fluff. That shot of 13 after she leaves the Ruth Doctor's TARDIS, attempting to just process what she's experienced, that's the emotional beat that should have defined this entire story, instead of just a percentage of it. It's not even just our two Doctors who make the A-plot a good time. Gat is a surprisingly well-realized character for how comparatively little screen time and action she has. But the highlight of the episode is obviously Jo Martin. Her performance is just really, really good, and I honestly wouldn't mind if Series 13 and beyond tried something really experimental and let her lead her own standalone episodes alongside Jodie. I accept her as a legitimate Doctor immediately, one who contrasts 13 in a way that creates a chemistry just as intriguing as any proper multi-Doctor story. She makes the episode. Overall, I was torn on this one first watch, and I remain torn on it now. I really, really, really want to give it a light plus, because the stuff in it that works is just so good, and I certainly can't give it a blank because boy did it leave an impression. But the sheer forced nature of the Captain Jack scenes makes a 5 to 6 minute cameo feel like a 20-minute detour, and it genuinely does hurt and distract from the episode's focus. When it gets going in the back half, Fugitive does indeed have its gold, but the total package feels so lacking in cohesion, I've gotta give it a light minus. Praxeus is a hard episode to fully come down on. It's got an intriguing, multi-pronged mystery setup that ends up resulting in what I think is a really cool premise conceptually. The Praxeus itself is genuinely kinda terrifying both visually and in the interesting notion that it operates uniquely for a virus and is something that humanity actively made itself vulnerable to. The reveal that Suki is the common denominator between all the goings-on of the episode and is performing literal human experiments is a great twist. And the biggest issue I have with the episode is that I'd like to have really explored her as a kinda sorta not really villain, and get an actual reaction to what she's done from the human she's affected. It's frustrating because I really feel like this episode could be capital G great if only there had been an extra 5 or 10 minutes where we explore these implications. There's a really interesting moral dilemma here where the Doctor is sympathetic to this woman and trying to help her survive, all while dealing with the fact that she's hurt every other person we've met this episode in some major ways. Killing her as quickly as we do feels too easy and like a waste of her actress who is performing the character with some real sympathy, I think. There's so much going on with this character just underneath the surface, and I'd love to have pulled it out into the actual dialogue. That said, for as sizable of an Achilles heel as that is, I love when Doctor Who takes time to just let a neat science fiction premise play out, which is why I can't find it in myself to give Praxeus a blank or a minus. That said, I also think this show is at its best when it's blending those premises with some more character-driven story. And outside of Adam, whose arc I do like a lot even if it feels tangential to the plot, all of the character moments in this story come from small isolated bits, and the morality is totally rushed over. I really don't dislike anything in Praxeus, but a lot of it frustrates me. I can see the core of a brilliant story trapped in the package that's just pretty good, and that hurts more than if there was nothing there. Praxeus gets a light plus regardless. Much like Praxeus, this is an episode that gets a lot of points for exploring what I find to be a clever premise. And I really like that this is an episode which makes good use of a somewhat larger cast, using most of its players effectively as a means of exploring one central theme through different angles. Yaz, Graham, Tahira, Tibbo, and even the Doctor herself all explore different degrees and varieties of mental health concerns, From 13 struggling with an inherent need for constant companionship even more than other doctors do, to Tibbo as a more paranoid brand of depression whom Ryan has to be the emotional anchor and support for, Yaz being the one who probably had it the worst of the lot at one point in life but has moved on to a better place with the help of her own emotional support in Sonia, and Graham as someone likewise in the process of moving on and coping with his worries, but who still has very justified feelings of concern. The episode treats all of its characters and their feelings seriously, and I find it really endearing, humanizing stuff. Fitting with that, the incredibly creepy atmosphere to the villains and all their scenes is palpable, and the presentation of the Immortals is really interesting. It's always nice seeing more abstract villains in a Doctor Who episode, and interdimensional despairavores who can create fear monsters made of nothing, exist beyond the confines of matter and logic, and use their detached fingers to get stuff done is exactly the kind of weird stuff I'm into. Exteriorizing mental health demons in the form of the terrifying but ephemeral Chagaska, along with those that prey on your fear, mental disarray, and self-loathing with the Immortals is really good. That said, while on paper I like the notion of trapping those very demons together in a never-ending cycle as the resolution, the rushed nature of the climax remains my biggest gripe with this one. Chibnall has had a real problem with pacing out his climaxes since the Power of Three, and it's something I really do hope he gets over. I also hope he gets over the compulsion to abuse the sonic screwdriver, as that too is quite annoying and at its absolute worst in this episode. And I love the sonic. Just, dial it back, man. Though the climax was pretty weak, I can forgive it if it's in service of the story's extended epilogue, showing us as everyone continues to move on and cope with their mental circumstances. Chibnall is at his best when he's writing the human drama and pathos scenes, and despite its issues, that aspect of it, along with the sheer conceptual oddness, carries this episode to greatness for me. And yes, I know some people really dislike how the episode handled the Doctor reacting to Graham's anxieties about his cancer. There's actually another video I helped work on for the other channel, which drives into why I think this scene is actually great stuff. So watch that one for my feelings on the whole discourse, linked in the corner and in the description. This one is on the knife's edge between a strong and light plus, but I'm gonna go with light just because it does have its not unsubstantial pacing problems. This episode would have done enough just by reminding me of Chimes of Midnight. There's part of my brain that kinda holds it against this episode how little it actually does with the spectacular premise of a Cyberman meeting the writer of Frankenstein. There's just so many neat parallels to be made in the text of the episode that unfortunately aren't there. That said, I really don't have many complaints besides. The freaky-deaky atmosphere and assortment of odd goings-on awaiting the cast in the eponymous house makes for some spectacular mounting tension. The whole cast is balanced really well here, and the primal appeal of a haunted house story comes through in spades. Then, when the lone Cyberman shows up and the back half becomes a lethal monster story, all the tension is paid off, and the character work done with the Doctor is spectacular. Something I think the 13th Doctor captures really well over the course of her tenure so far, and something that Chibnall deserves more credit for, is how the show's big three baddies, the Master, the Daleks, and now the Cybermen, all get a reaction out of her that is far more personal and grave than an Enemy of the Week. Too often, including in the upcoming story, Cybermen are cannon fodder, and episodes where they show up don't tend to make the animosity that the Doctor has for them as palpable as their other main adversaries. Here, you really do feel the losses the Doctor has suffered at their hands, and you can tell that this situation hits her different. The true climax of the episode isn't her facing off over the MacGuffin with the Cyberman, but instead her debating temporal morality with her companions. It's the first time that any true schism has ever threatened to form between the fam. And not only does it work great as a Doctor speech in a vacuum, but it also ties in perfectly to 13's arc over the course of the series. That underneath all the pretense that she helps perpetuate of their relationship being equal, she really does feel distanced and alone from the companions, if only due to how much authority she has over them and everyone else in existence. It is golden character work, and on top of everything else, it helps to make the haunting of Villa Diodati a strong plus. Ah, God, I hate controversy. A none too small factor in the delay of this video is that I just didn't want to speak at length to this two-part finale. Having to navigate the reactions to this story's central choices, the way the reveal of the Doctor's origins almost if not completely broke the show for some people, that's just really badly daunting, and it's the thing that I have to spend most of this section talking about since the companion's presence remains true to what I've been saying all throughout this video already. Decent moments scattered throughout, but also a lot of padding for time and barely any noteworthy character growth or arc conclusion you'd hope for in a finale. The handling of the Cybermen coming off the last episode is also a little bit of a letdown in the sense that this show almost never takes advantage of the meaningful distinction between Cybermen and generic robots. With one exception. Ashad is still a really interesting figure. I love the idea of a Cyberman stuck partway through the conversion process, disgusted by their own human half, and that even parallels brilliantly with the Master, with him feeling an intense self-hatred upon discovering that they have a bit of the Doctor's essence inside of them. I wish we didn't remove Ashad from the story quite so unceremoniously, though. What really threatens to kill the story for me is the incredibly contrived resolution with Kosharmus at the end. Not only does he get the Doctor out of what should have been an inescapable predicament, he also absolves her of any personal responsibility in the Cybermen's rise to power through a clunky exposition dump. As I mentioned earlier, even Chibnall's best stories struggle with resolution, and this is probably the worst example yet. The stuff with Brendan is real weird. I genuinely have zero clue how we're meant to interpret any of his scenes. It obviously ties to the Timeless Child narrative somehow, but is it an actual part of the chronological series of events, or, as some have suggested, just a dense, purely symbolic parallel to the story as relayed by the Master? I really like the idea if it's the latter, this incredibly esoteric subplot that's not even a subplot because it's pure abstraction. If that's what it is, then it's a really bizarre, ballsy writing choice. It also means one less plot thread left dangling for next series. And yes, we don't get any resolution on the Ruth Doctor, which I didn't personally expect to happen in Series 12 anyway. That said, I suppose it's time for my nuclear hot take, which is that I'm fine with the Timeless Child reveal itself. I don't think it destroys canon, I don't think it removes any essential mystery to the Doctor's character, I don't think having the Doctor be the source of the Time Lord regeneration ability does any real harm to that concept, and I don't think having a bunch of regenerations predating Hartnell's adoption of the name Doctor for the first time destroys the sanctity of the role, or disrespects the previous actors, or whatever. Etc, 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 fight me in the comments. What I do think is that the way these revelations are used to tell us about the Doctor and Master's characters in the present is fascinating, and ultimately in line with one of the things I like most about Chibnall's era and 13 as a character. That being that underneath all her uncertainty about herself and all the genuine insecurity and distress that can breed, she looks at a revelation that would shake others to their very core and finds the positive identity-affirming side of it. Seeing her identity crisis resolve, I feel genuine happiness and relief for 13. When she wakes up and finds her friends there waiting for her and just quietly whispers to herself, "My family." I don't care if you think that's stupid, that hits me in my heart. That's effective television for me. And I just think that these interactions across the Timeless Children between her and the Master are such a beautifully simple encapsulation of the dynamic between them. Their scenes together get slighted by many as pure exposition, but they're the most engrossed I've been in scenes between the Doctor and Master across the entire modern series. And that is actually saying a lot, because for as much as I might slag on the episodes they feature in, there is some gold to be found whenever you put Tennant and Sim or Capaldi and Gomez on screen together. But here, I don't know, I just really feel what used to be friendship soured into pure contempt by what the Doctor points out is the Master's all-consuming fear in the face of her endless hope, which, boy is that a way to frame their entire history as characters. And it's not even as simple as a binary. The Master has reason to believe the Doctor would give in to fear and hopelessness at having her self-perceptions shattered just as he did. She certainly displays signs of fear over the issue when it comes up, and while I don't think the Doctor going postal was ever really on the table, suffering the same kind of breakdown her own fans did at the revelation is something she only narrowly avoids. And once again, just endless kudos to Sacha Dhawan. Just as Whittaker is able to completely sell thin-skinned faux bravado covering deep-seated existential terror covering even deeper-seated self-confidence, the Master is brimming with a thinner skin of casual humor covering rage and anger and hatred covering someone who is just deeply, deeply sad and afraid. I know, it doesn't work for everyone. It might not even work for most people, but as a guy who likes reading deep into character, I just find too much of value in this finale to dismiss it. I respect the Timeless Children if for no other reason than choosing to ultimately be a story of emotion and personal reflection that got the intended emotional, reflective response from me. So yeah, it's pretty okay. I give it a light plus. So that leaves us with 4 light pluses, 2 strong pluses, 1 strong minus, and 1 light minus. Like I said, this is a super broad, just for fun rating scale, which leaves us with an enjoyment ratio of 75% for the whole series. Congrats, Doctor Who, that's 2 whole percentage points higher than Series 11. Keep up this kind of improvement, and within 2 years you'll get the kind of grades that won't flunk you out of grad school. It feels kind of weird to have let this script sit for as long as I have, months after the fiery extreme reactions to this series have left the social discussion, only to come down on what's probably a more tame reaction to Series 12 than most. It's pretty good. Far, far, far from perfect. I have generally more positive to say about any given episode than I do negative, with one glaring exception, to the point that I'm pretty much middle of the road even as I lament the easy fan favorite and stamp my approval on the most divisive story in years. On the whole, I just think of Series 12 as a decent, solid enough string of decent, solid enough Doctor Who, more consistent in that sense than Series 11 was. Tell you what, Series 12 is probably the weirdest and most high concept this show has been in a while, and I'd love for us to continue going even further in that direction next year. For now, I'm content to say I was fairly satisfied with Doctor Who Series 12. I certainly hope to be more than fairly satisfied with my all-time favorite show in the future, but in the present, I'm just eager to hold on to all the bright spots in the darkness that I can find. Whew, boy, that was a lot. I certainly hope it was at least a fraction worth the wait. That said, I wasn't kidding about that fight me comment earlier. I really do want you guys to have some discourse in the comment section about where you agree and disagree with me on the series as a whole, individual episodes, character arcs, or whatever. My perceptions of a lot of things in this series changed as I wrote and reflected on this video, and I don't know, I suppose it's always just refreshing to do more structured analytical writing about this show. Speaking of which, in case you haven't already, remember to take part in the community poll, linked in the description, where you can decide what kind of video format I focus on in future. Right now, it looks like you guys are definitely in for some more scripted Doctor Who content. Here's hoping that you enjoy that, and if so, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the future.